Hello, in this class I'm going to give you some simple tools to help you deal with an unseen poem or an unseen piece of comprehension. Whether you're an exam student facing into those sections in your upcoming exam, or you simply want to know the ways in which a poet is using stylistic features to help convey their tone or their theme, then stick with me, and within 30 minutes I'm going to give you a mnemonic which will allow you to do a critical analysis of any poem or piece of prose you might face. In the course of this, although it's concentrating on unseen poetry, I'm also going to touch upon all of these. For those of you who are doing Leaving Cert in Ireland, then you're going to recognise these names. Most of them are on the prescribed course. But essentially what we're talking about here is the idea of cracking a code. Whatever your feelings are about trying to measure emotional and intellectual reactions to great literature, your problem if you're facing an exam is that you need to figure out what the examiner wants from you, the marking scheme, and you need to meet or exceed their expectations. And it doesn't matter whether you're facing an exam like the Leaving Cert or the A-level or the International Baccalaureate, the same thing applies. So essentially, we know of only one code that's never been broken, and that's the Navajo, the code talkers from World War II. And in this instance, what we're talking about is simple techniques. I'm not trying to equate poetry with maths. They're obviously very, very different things. As Samuel Taylor Coleridge said when he talked about the difference between prose and poetry, prose is words in their best order, whereas poetry is the right words in the best order. I'm some experience in poetry myself. This is the very first poem I published quite a few years ago, which a recognition one morning looking out my back window of the ways in which my life and my wife's life changed from being a romantic couple to suddenly becoming parents, and the changes that brought about. You're not going to come across something quite that easy when you go into the exam. This is an example of the unseen poem which appeared on last year 2019's Leaving Cert. It's quite complex. It may be that when you face a poem for the first time in an exam, you're not immediately clear what the poem is all about. Actually, it really doesn't matter. I'm going to show you a very, very simple mnemonic, and if you remember nothing else, just remember this: F slits T. If you use this as a structure for your critical analysis, whether that's a poem or a piece of comprehension, you really can't go wrong. So let's start with the first of those, the F for form. Well, the majority of the poems you're going to face fit into one of these categories. You have ballads, which simply are narratives or stories, odes, which address either the reader or an object, for example, Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, lyrics, which are typically like songs, they're poems, typically with very short verses expressing strong emotions, elegies, which reflect on death and loss. All of those are most likely on your exam course. We also have the sonnet, probably the most famous of all the forms of poetry. In general, they are either Petrarchan or Shakespearean. If you want to know the difference between the two, then just look at the last two lines. If they rhyme, it's a Shakespearean sonnet. In all cases with a sonnet, it's very strict. There are always 14 lines, and the lines always have 10 syllables. If it doesn't fit that, then it's almost certainly not a sonnet. And then there's two other things you may come across you may want to understand. First is blank verse, and the second is free verse. And sometimes people struggle to distinguish between the two. Essentially, blank verse is lines of regular length, but they're just unrhymed. And the most common form of that is iambic pentameter, and I'm going to come to that in a minute. And then free verse, the lines can be of any length and typically don't have a consistent length and tend not to have consistent rhyme either. So iambic pentameter, well, let's unpick that for a second. Most of you may be aware of what that is, but if you don't, I'm going to show you a very simple way to understand it. And I'm going to start by using Shakespeare's Sonnet 60. This is the opening line, one of the most famous opening lines in any poem. Like as the waves make towards the pebble shore. And the first thing we notice is there are indeed 10 syllables, like as the waves make towards the pebble shore. But going beyond this, what we also see is that every second syllable is stressed. The voice naturally, because of the long vowels here, tends to stress the second in each pair of syllables, like as the waves make towards the pebble shore. Essentially what you have is I am, short vowel, long vowel, unstressed and stressed. And penta in Greek just means 5. So really all iambic pentameter means is that in each line you have 5 iams. So let's look at some examples of form, and these are taken from the current Leaving Cert course. We have The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost, written in 1916, which is interesting when you think about the theme of the poem and the backdrop historically to when that poem was written. We have Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey by William Wordsworth, and a more modern poem, And Jennifer's Tigers by Adrian Rich, which is from 1951. But what we can see also is that they have very distinctive forms. The first one, The Road Not Taken, is clearly a ballad. It's a poem effectively telling a story. It's a narrative about the poet going into a wood and making a choice between one direction and another in a symbolic way. Lines Composed Above Tintern Abbey is a lyric. It's a poem expressing very strong emotion. It has a musical feel to it all the way through. What you might not have immediately spotted is it's also written in blank verse. Although it sounds very conversational, every line is of 10 syllables. It's unrhymed, but with a very regular meter. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. It sounds as if it's unstructured, but in reality, there's a real sense of control here. And obviously, the model here is Shakespeare. Now, most of Shakespeare's plays are written in blank verse. One of the reasons for that is it makes it easier for the actors to remember what is often very, very large parts. And then lastly, we have And Jennifer's Tigers by Adrian Rich. And what might not be immediately obvious is this is actually written in iambic pentameter. Again, the lines are all of 10 syllables long, but in this instance, we also have a very regular rhyme scheme which runs all the way through the poem. So there you are, that's form. Some very, very simple ones, the ballad, the lyric, iambic pentameter. We're going to talk about some of those other examples as we go further into the class. But let's go to the next thing, the S. The first of the S's, which is sound. Now, sound effects are not used for their own purposes. They're used to help convey the tone. Poets use them in different ways to create different effects, but essentially what they're trying to do is to either speed up, slow down, or draw emphasis to particular lines or words within the poem. Rhyme, you know what it is. Assonance is the use of repeated long or short vowels to convey tone. So if you're using long vowels, O's, A's, U's, the impact of that, if there's a lot of them used in a line, is to slow that line down, which in turn draws your attention to it. If you're trying to create typically the poet will use a lot of I's and E's for the line to run fast. If for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, is using particular consonants repeatedly during the line. Now, the difference between consonants and alliteration, which again is about the use of consonants, is that alliteration always has the same consonant at the start of a word, where consonants typically uses them throughout words all the way through. A couple of other things you'll come across, sibilance, which is just the repeated use of the sibilant S, that sound, again for effect. Onomatopoeia, which I'm sure you all know, and good luck if you're trying to spell it correctly in the exam. It's something I still struggle with. And then lastly, something which also controls sound, which is the use of punctuation, whether that's the use of an exclamation or just the use of punctuation to either, again, slow down or speed up a line to help convey the tone. You know, one poet we're going to see doing that a lot is Emily Dickinson, and we'll come to some of her poetry a little later. So let's look for some examples of that. And probably the best way to remember it and to illustrate that is through the use of Irish insults. So for example, take this one. Langer is a typical Limerick phrase. So if someone was talking about that lardy arse Langer, what you'd see straight away is this is a clear example of alliteration. The L's in lardy arse and Langer. But what you might not have noticed as well is that there's also assonance. Every one of the words there uses a long A, which really draws attention to the line and slows it down to make it more impactful. That lardy arse Langer. Contrast this with this one, you know, those sick, thick shit kickers. It's quicker, and you immediately spotted the assonance that allows that to sound more slick and quick. It's the short I that is used throughout, in fact, 3 of the 4 words. What we're also seeing, though, is consonants. So the CK repeated in 3 of the 4 words, which again is there for emphasis and really has an effect upon the sound and the way in which the tone is conveyed. And what we also see is sibilance. You know, those sibilant S's and those sick shit kickers, those 3 sibilant S's that you see throughout it. So there's sound, let's move on. And then we get to language. Well, regardless of whether you're facing a poem or a piece of comprehension, the first thing you're going to be able to say is whether that poem or piece of comprehension contains long words or short words. You don't need to know much to be able to identify that. Except for exam purposes, we're not going to call it that. If the words are long, they almost certainly come from Latin, because that's where most of the long words in the English language come from. So what you'd say instead of long words is that the writer is using Latinate diction. Similarly, most short words, including all the words you'll use if you drop something heavy on your toe, come from Anglo-Saxon. So again, short, clipped language, Anglo-Saxon diction. What else can you say very easily without, again, even understanding what the piece is about? Well, the words are probably either old or new. But in this case, again, the phrases we'd use would be archaic diction for old and modern or contemporary diction for new. So let's talk about a few other things that you could quickly identify. Well, one of them is the apostrophe. And apostrophe here isn't that piece of punctuation which is continually misused in shop signs. It's here an apostrophe is a direct address by the poet or the writer to the reader. So when the poet is directly talking to someone or talking to you, that's an apostrophe. Pathos is when the poet or the writer is trying to appeal to your sympathies, trying to make you feel sorry either for themselves or for a character within the piece of writing. Cliche, again, you're already very familiar with. A couple of others you'll come across: an oxymoron. Military intelligence is probably the most famous of them. Effectively two words in which each word apparently contradicts the other. Puns, again, you'll recognize. Sarcasm in the same. Tautology is something that many people miss, but it's always a good one to identify. Effectively, tautology is when a word is used which is completely superfluous. There's no such thing as most unique. If it's unique, it's unique. And equally with completely empty. If something's empty, there you have it. So some others you can illustrate or identify: colloquialisms, which is just the use of modern language, common language, slang, things of that nature; and figurative language, which effectively is the opposite, where language is being used in a very deliberate way, but perhaps not as natural to conversation in order to make some form of comparison. Two others which are opposites are hyperbole and understatement. So if something is being deliberately exaggerated for effect, it's an example of hyperbole, and the opposite obviously with understatement. And then these last three, which people often get confused by. Personification is when you give human characteristics to inanimate objects. Anthropomorphism is when those characteristics are being given to an animal. And then lastly, pathetic fallacy, which is the one people often struggle with, is when you're attributing emotions to an inanimate object. So if you're giving them characteristics, saying something is walking, that's personification. If you're suggesting that the object is feeling something or experiencing an emotion, that's pathetic fallacy. So again, let's look to illustrate that in some of the poems that you might be familiar with. The first is Child of Our Time by Evan Boland, which begins: "Yesterday I knew no lullaby, but you have taught me overnight to order this song, which takes from your final cry its tune, from your unreasoned end its reason." Or this one by D.H. Lawrence, The Mosquito: "When did you start your tricks, monsieur? What do you stand on such high legs for? Why this length of shredded shrank you exaltation?" In both cases, the poets are using apostrophe. They're speaking directly to somebody. To the child in Evan Boland's poem, directly to the mosquito itself in D.H. Lawrence's. What you might also spot is the use of both pathetic fallacy and anthropomorphism at the end of the mosquito. When he talks about sluggish Venice, that's an example of pathetic fallacy. Sluggish suggests overawed, tired, an emotional response. And of course, Venice as a city can't experience that in reality. When he talks about the mosquito turning around and smiling, he's attributing human characteristics to, in this case, an animal and insects. So let's keep going. A few others. The Bend in the Road by Eileen Ní Chulháin, which is a wonderful beginning to a poem, a very reflective, meditative, ruminative poem about loss. But actually, if you look at the use of stylistic features to communicate that tone, they're really interesting. This is a masterful example of sibilance, to control that tone and bring across that sense of contemplation. Look how many of those sibilant S's are here. Piled high, wrapped lightly, like the one cumulus cloud in a perfect sky, softly packed like the air, is all that went on in those years, the absences, the faces never long absent from thought, The bodies alive then in the airy space they took up when we saw them wrapped and sealed by sickness, guessing the piled weight of sleep. Really effective use of sibilants, and you can hear and see the impact that has upon the tone. Or this one by Paul Durkin, wife who smashed television gets jail. She came home, my lord, and smashed in the television. Me and the kids were peaceably watching Kojak when she walked into the living room and declared that if I didn't turn off the television immediately, she'd put her boot through the screen. Now, obviously, colloquialism, this is a poem that's written very much in modern parlance, but also we're seeing assonance. He gets that impact of that really powerful last line through the use of long vowels. She put her boot through the screen. It makes it emphatic. It gives it that sense of an ending to the passage. And it's used obviously very deliberately. And on we go. Now I'm very conscious to this stage, all we've seen is examples of words on the screen. So I just want to break that with some visuals. You know, here we have some fireflies like lit confetti in a wood. This is a picture of Paris, you know, with its rain-slickened streets on a lonely evening. This picture here, this is the beach at Youghal in County Cork with the ancient posts like stoic sentinels facing the sea. Or this one, spears of light invading the gloom of a staircase. Or perhaps this last one, the woods at Kylemore House, you know, a bastion of the old ways in a changing world. And obviously all of these here are to illustrate the next thing we're going to come to, which is the I and the F slits T. Typically in an exam or in general when you examine poetry, there's three key types of images you'd be asked to identify or should know about. The first is the simile, when you're saying something is like something else or it's as something else. You know, here the example is he's as dumb as a bag of spanners. A metaphor where you're making a direct comparison between one thing and another without like or as. You're saying that this is something else. He's a spanner. And then finally symbol, where there's something representing another thing or an idea which runs all the way through the poem. You know, for example, the common phrase about communist Russia, and they talk often about the hammer of oppression. So let's again look at some examples from poetry that you might be familiar with. This first one is from Evan Boland's The Famine Road. Why for that, cunning as housewives, each eyed as if at a corner butcher, the other's buttock, talking about the extremes of hunger during the famine. But what we also have here are two examples of simile. There's cunning as housewives, the first one, but also as if at a corner butcher. You know, here again, another example, this from Wordsworth's Composed upon Westminster Bridge. The city now doth, like a garment, wear the beauty of the morning. That comparison, very effective, very deliberate. And we compare that, for example, with this one. This is from Emily Dickinson's The Soul Has Bandaged Moments. As did the bee, delirious born, long dungeon from his rose touch liberty. In this instance, we're not told that the rose was like a dungeon for the bee. There's a direct comparison, and this therefore is a metaphor. Another example of this is from Paul Durkin's Six Nuns Dying Convent Inferno. He describes a lifetime of umbrellas drying out in the kitchen. It's a way of communicating what life was like for those nuns in this very traditional way of life. In fact, a way of life which involves stepping away from life. And the umbrellas drying in the kitchen is a metaphor to help convey that. And lastly, the use of symbol. This is from Robert Frost's Mending Wall, where all the way through the poem, a wall is being used as a symbol for different attitudes to community or social interaction. In the quote here, we have Frost saying, before I built a wall, I'd asked to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offence. It's clearly about more than simply building walls between properties. And on we go to the next one, and we're moving quite fast. And on this stage, we get to tone. Now, what I'd reiterate again is tone is often just another word for atmosphere or mood or feeling or emotion. And it's most likely in an exam, they'll use one of those words as opposed to tone, but effectively they're synonyms. The other thing to point out is that tone is the result of the use of stylistic features. We already talked about how sound effects like accents and alliteration can draw emphasis to a line or can slow that line down or speed it up for effect. Similarly, imagery is a very effective way of bringing across the poet's view of a subject. And then lastly, we have those direct appeals to the reader's emotions, things like the apostrophe, which we showed earlier, or exclamation, or the use of pathos and so on. So tone is the result of the use of stylistic features as opposed to simply something itself. And if they ask you to talk about the tone, the important thing is that you don't just identify the tone, you identify the things that help convey that tone. So here, for an example from Eileen Cordon's Lucinda Shinning on the Silence of the Nacht, we have this couple of lines. Behind me, the waves of darkness lay, the plague of mice, plague of beetles crawling out of the spine of books. You know, it's really, really effective, you know, as a sort of eerie conjecture or an eerie way of presenting a scenario. But what we also see here is the use of both assonance and repetition. You know, the long A's all the way through, and the waves of darkness lay, the plague of mice, plague of beetles crawling out of the spine of books, and that long double O at the end. And the repetition of the plague of mice, the plague of beetles, again, really helps to convey the tone of the poem. So what is style then? Well, effectively, when we talk about style, we're talking about the use of all of these techniques or devices, or rather, when we talk about a poet's particular style, it's the features of style that they use, which together convey a very distinct or unique voice. No poet you'll find in any poem will use all of these, but the ones they choose and the ones they most commonly use help you to identify their particular style. You know, let's look at an example. You know, if this was your first encounter with a poem by Emily Dickinson, it would be reasonable enough for you to read it and say, I haven't a clue what it means. There is a certain slant of light in winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. What is she on about? Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. Now you could be scratching your head at this stage and thinking, if you were in an exam scenario, I'm screwed. I really don't know what this is about. But actually there's an awful lot that you can discern straight away and that you can comment on that would result in you giving marks. And if you're just fascinated with what makes Emily Dickinson so different, so unusual as a poet, there are some things here that you can identify straight away. Well, let's see how many things we can figure out about this poem without actually understanding it. Well, you know, using our F-slits T, the first thing we'll see is this is a lyric. We've got those short lines, short verses, and this is something that is very clearly conveying an emotion. It's very ruminative and very, very slow, but it is an emotional poem as opposed to a ballad, which would be telling a story. Secondly, we see a lot of alliteration, and it's quite effective. So we look at the heavenly hurt, for example, in verse 2, or the landscape listens in verse 4. Very powerful, and again, they have that impact of drawing attention to the line or slowing it down. We also have consonants. Look at the use of the long or throughout most of the poem. You know, it's there in the first 3 verses, which is interesting. So there's a certain slant of light in winter afternoons that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it anything, 'tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. But what's perhaps most telling is the fact that it is dropped for the use of verse 4. When it comes, the landscape listens, shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. And we give this effect of a sudden speeding up and trailing off, which is very typical of Emily Dickinson. She sort of leaves you with this thought. So the use of consonants, again, is quite masterful, but also very effective. What else do we see? Well, obviously we see assonance. We see a lot of long vowels. We see double vowels being used all the way through. And you know, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. Look at that very last line and the amount of assonance that being used to slow it down and give it that, you know, finale, that final punch at the very end. We also rhyme, but what's perhaps most interesting here is not just the use of rhyme, but the use of half rhyme. You know, light and weight aren't full rhymes. We have the GHT in both cases, but they don't fully rhyme. Similarly, with anything in affliction in verse 3, there's the long A at the start, but the rest of the words don't fully rhyme. That's half rhyme. And again, it's very effective and very typical of her. You know, what else do we have here? Well, we have archaic diction. The language she uses is quite old-fashioned, even for her own time. You know, we have in verse 3, 'tis the seal despair. And then in the second last line of the poem, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. What else? We have personification when she talks about the landscape listens. Obviously, the landscape, an inanimate thing, cannot do this thing which humans do, which is to listen. But we also have pathetic fallacy. When she talks about shadows holding their breath, that's suggesting emotion. That's suggesting, fear or something of that nature. So it's pathetic fallacy in this instance. And we have the use of simile. 'Tis like the distance on the look of death, or in the first verse, that oppresses like the weight of cathedral tunes. We also have metaphor used in the poem. 'Tis the seal despair, or an imperial affliction. Things being compared, but without using like or as. And finally, we have symbol. What does the certain slant of light symbolize? Well, you can claim it's a symbol, as some have, of death or of despair. But what we notice straight away is this is an awful lot that you can identify and talk about in a poem that you may not understand. In fact, you'll also find, if Emily Dickinson is a poet you're studying, that she uses all of these things. This is something that's common to and typical of her poetry. And it's this combination of all of these stylistic features which give her what we call her style, her unique voice. So what we then come to at this stage, well, the punctuation, just to mention that quickly as well, is something very distinctive of her as well. You'll see her using double punctuation, places where she'll have a comma and a hyphen together. She uses a lot of semicolons. Again, that has the impact upon tone. It slows the poem down. It makes you pay more attention at particular stages. And again, it's something very, very typical of her style. So at last we come to theme, the last of the F slits T. Well, what is the theme? Effectively, it's what the poet is writing about, or their belief about the central concern. And the good news here is you can't be wrong. The reality is, whatever view you have, whatever opinion you express, as long as you can back it up with some lines, some quotes from the poem itself, then your subjective view is as good as anyone else's. And that's the view the examiner will take. He won't walk in, or she won't walk into a situation where they're reading their answer where they have decided that there is a set correct view of what the poem is about. It's up to you to put your own view forward. The good news is, in this instance, is even if you get it wrong, as long as you can point to things that are said by the poet, or point to stylistic devices used by the poet to support your view, you're still going to do well. So there's the key things. F slits T, form, sound, language, imagery, tone, style, theme. Remember that mnemonic, and effectively there's nothing you won't be able to deal with. We look again at the wound in time from last year's exam paper 2019. You're probably looking at that straight away, and you're noticing the language. You're noticing the use of things like apostrophe. You're being able to spot examples of simile and metaphor. And I guarantee if you took a few minutes with this mnemonic, you're going to have no problem unpicking it. Similarly, the unseen poem from the year before, again, you're going to be seeing the use of rhyme, free verse, use of images, different types all the way through, and the poem from the year before. Again, there's nothing here that you can't deal with. There's nothing here with this mnemonic that you couldn't unpick, or at least be able to refer to in the course of giving your answers. In most cases, you may not be asked about the style at all, but you should still identify, for example, if they're talking about the mood or atmosphere, talk about the things that convey it. Talk about assonance and alliteration. Talk about simile and metaphor. Talk about the type of language that's being used. And this doesn't just apply to the unseen poem. The comprehension passages you might face in your exam, you can use exactly the same tool for. Well, the forms will be different. You might get a piece of journalism, you might find something that's a speech, or different forms of that nature, but everything else applies. You'll again see the writer using alliteration, assonance, things of that nature. You'll again be able to comment on the language with all the various different language features we mentioned earlier. Writers of prose also use simile and metaphor, and you see examples of those. And tone in the same way, and the culmination of all of those effects, the writer's style. So, whether it was last year's comprehension text, the year before from Colin, and again, I know that you can be looking at this straight away and you're seeing the difference in the language that's used. We have in the second paragraph here, he says the first line should open up your rib cage. It should reach in and twist your heart backwards. Metaphors, very deliberate contrasts or comparisons being made without the use of like or as. Again, take the mnemonic, you can apply it to anything that's here. And again, the same from the exam before, from the great God Bono. And whatever your view of him might be, you're now in a position to analyze the way in which he writes, whether you're going to come out with a positive or a negative view of his style. What you can do is analyze it very, very simply. So at this stage, I just want to go to a quick Q&A. When I was giving the class, we did actually get a few questions, which I said I would address in the video. So Eve asked, would you suggest including a personal opinion on the unseen poetry in our answers? And the answer is absolutely. What I'm suggesting is that you support your opinion with references to the stylistic features in the poem which informed your opinion and led you to that belief. Rob asks, he says, I've been taught the pathetic fallacy is when you use the external environment to describe emotion. For example, the dark clouds brood over the funeral. Is this different, or is there more to it? Well, the answer is attributing human emotions to the external environment is indeed an example of pathetic fallacy. Your teacher's right. As I'm sure he or she would also tell you, it's not restricted to the external environment alone, but can be used to reference in any inanimate non-human object which is being given the impression or the sentiment of human emotion. Alison asked, do you think it's easier to get better marks on question 1 or question 2 of the unseen poetry? Again, what I would say in both instances when we talk about style, we're again just concentrating on making sure that you make enough references and identify enough of the features to support your answer. And lastly, Amy asked if there were any predicted poets for the exam I could mention in sample questions they might ask. Amy, I'm sorry, I'm just too long out of the classroom to do that. Your teacher's the best one to ask, and they're much more clued in. They're the ones with their ear to the ground, and they're the ones with the experience of getting this right. So before I conclude, just 3 last things. First of all, if you're watching this video during the COVID-19 crisis, just remember these 3 things. Particularly stay away from people who are most vulnerable. You guys are probably going to recover even if you get it, but there are people, whether they've got a pre-existing condition or they're just old and frail, would have difficulty. So just leave them alone. But the other thing I'd say on the opposite of that is keep in touch with your friends. You are more isolated in ways than many others. And the fact that you're facing the stress of an exam can even exacerbate that. So stay in touch and use some form of medium which allows you to look at each other just rather than hear each other's voices. It can be really important. The second thing I'd say is if you found this of value, please go to the website, stephenduggan.net/free classes, and leave a comment. Not only leave a comment, but if there's something you'd like me to do in another class on, some suggestion, something that either puzzles you or you'd like some reinforcement in, pop it into the comments box. I haven't decided what I'm going to do for my next classes yet. One of the reasons why I covered so many of the course poets this time was because I had a request to do so within the comments box on the website. And lastly, I'm doing these classes for free, but the main purpose behind that is to raise money for a loan. Particularly at the time, this is a charity which is focused on helping older people who might be in difficulty. And right now, that's a real concern. Alone are also starved of money that they would originally have got from having people standing on street corners or in streets shaking collection tins. That's not happening. In fact, all their online donations tend to be down as well because people concentrate on their immediate concerns. And as we know, there's an awful lot of people out of work right now who don't know when their next few quid are going to come from. As a result, on the website, 2 of the books I've written are for sale, and all proceeds from the sale of those books will go to a loan. So if you found this of value, raid your parents' wallets. You know what they pay for extra classes if any of you had grinds. We're talking about a few quid in each case, and the money is going to a good cause. And if you don't want to do that, please just go to loan.ie and make a donation there. And that's it. That's pretty much it for this class. As I said, I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do for the next class. Feel free to suggest things. Go onto the website, pop in a comment, let me know if there's other things that I could change or improve. And until next time, thank you very much.